Hello and welcome to Into the Woods with Holly Wharton. This podcast is all about our journey into the woods of ourselves, getting to know who we are, and where we're going in life so that we can create the life that we want to live. It's about deepening your connection with yourself, taking inspired action, and really trusting yourself and your intuition. It's also about mindset. Our beliefs are such an important part of this journey. And there are so many ways for us to change our mindset so that we can more easily live a life of expansive joy. This podcast is also about going literally into the woods and spending time in nature, and how that can help us on our own personal journey of self-knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now let's get into this week's episode. Hello, adventurers, and welcome to the Into the Woods podcast, episode 494. This is your host, Holly Wharton, and I'm back with another exciting guest. Today, I'm talking with Gwen Zywicke about her book, Ultrarunning Mysticism, which I mentioned in last week's episode. And I really enjoyed that book, and I really wanted to have a chat with her because I think this is a concept that a lot of us have experienced through not just ultra running, but endurance sports in general, but don't have the words to describe. And that's why I love this book so much. So, Gwen is a senior instructor of communication studies at Louisiana State University. She's an ultrarunner and she's a perpetual student of philosophy. And the reason she wrote this book is because she was having these experiences, didn't understand them, and so she started doing research to figure out what was happening. And the results are this book, which I will link to in the show notes. I hope you find this episode interesting, and I hope that it answers a lot of the questions that you may have had about these mystical endurance experiences. Hello, Gwen. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Holly. I'm fantastic. How are you?
Good, thank you. I'm very excited to talk to you about your very interesting book.
Well, thank you. And I'm very honored to be on your podcast. So thank you for inviting me.
So I recently read your book, Ultrarunning Mysticism, Mind, Body, Spirit, and the Sacredness of Overcoming Suffering. So what is mysticism? And more importantly, what is ultrarunning mysticism?
Those are awesome questions. So mysticism is defined differently by different philosophers. And what I did is I used the most common definitions. And as you know, I broke it down into certain categories. So it's really funny because when I actually went to school for my graduate degree in philosophy while I teach at LSU, and they have this great thing where they support us to advance our own interests and whatever. So I was able to, while I was teaching, actually go to grad school at the same time. Interestingly, I'm an ultra runner, which is run any distance that is over a marathon, which is 26.2 miles for fun. So that's a big part of my life. And so at that time was philosophy and of course my career at LSU. And so I was playing with a lot of different ideas. I wanted to think about writing about the sublime and how is felt when you're ultra running. I could not figure out what was happening when myself and others got to a certain point in our races, which was usually different for everyone, but usually around mile 30, 40, something really amazing happens. And everybody experiences, but nobody knows what it is. And I would ask people, and they say, I don't know. So I am very curious by nature. So I decided I wanted to find out. And I studied defining God and I studied the sublime. Initially, I was going to go with the sublime, which I later found out basically in my research is God. But what happened is I found that the experience was more mystical. Mm-hmm. And as defined by various philosophers, I sort of took little pieces of that. And that's how I define the experience of what happens to ultra runners at that point in their race when they're experiencing this overwhelming feeling of peace and joy.
Mm. So how long had you been experiencing this before you decided to write a book about it?
I have been an ultra runner now for, oh my goodness, I think 11 years.
Nice.
Thank you. And I have been experiencing it almost from the beginning, my first year. And a lot of other friends, even race directors, I would ask people, what is this? And the funny thing is, always can tell when somebody's experiencing it, like when they come into an aid station or whatever, everybody knows. You can see it in them. You can feel it.
Yeah.
And I just didn't know what it was. And curiosity just got to me. And I spent 3 years just researching constantly trying to figure out what was going on. And I still don't completely know, but I have a pretty good idea of some of the things that contribute. And that's what the book is about.
Mm. So in the book, you talk about the 9 characteristics of mystical experiences. What are those and how do they relate to ultrarunning mysticism?
Well, I will tell you that those were basically what I ended up going with. That was essentially how it was defined. So when I was actually doing that with William Stace, I chose William Stace specifically because of the way he gave specific breakdowns of what that mysticism is. So it's internal unity, external unity, feelings of infinite time and space, inner subjectivity, objectivity, and reality, sacredness, deeply felt peace and joy, paradoxicality, and ineffability. And so, as I broke those things down and I did some research on all of those, literally all of our experiences at that point into all of those characteristics. So that's how I decided to use Stace's specific mysticism criteria when writing this book.
Hmm. And do people experience all of those characteristics, or do they experience some in some experiences and others in others? How does that work?
In all honesty, Holly, everyone I interviewed and everyone I've spoken to about this, and in my book, I can't even tell you how many interviews I put in the book, but I did interview a lot more people than are actually published in that book. And every single person experienced every single criteria. In
Mm.
fact, I didn't even have to tell them. I just gave them the criteria, like, oh, yeah, it was just there. I
Mhm.
didn't have to coax it out of them. I didn't have to try to say, is there anything at all? I didn't have to dig deep because it was right there.
Mm.
Everybody knew it. Yeah.
So how does this happen? How do people tap into these mystical experiences during endurance sports?
Well, what's interesting is I broke it down into the mind, body, spirit. And when the first chapter of my book is basically talking about precedents all the way back 100, actually thousands of years, but if you're going to go all the way back to the Greek Olympics, but I started researching the Tendai monks of Mount Hiei, and I have a Japanese friend who reminds me repeatedly that I'm mispronouncing that. So my apologies, but it's a very sacred practice to have all sorts of endurance. The Tibetan monks, there are Tibetan monks who will actually run 200 miles in a trance. Native Americans, Native Peruvians, Native, literally, I could not find a culture in my research. Every culture I looked at had some sort of connection to having a physical, mental, and spiritual connection simultaneously. So it was true of the monks, it was true of the Native Americans. You might call this like a vision quest. In a sense, it's pretty much the same thing, different focuses, but nonetheless, the results were the same. It was just a phenomenal thing. The more research I did, I was like, I'm onto something here. I'm really onto something. And I kept digging and digging. And sure enough, it was pretty much everywhere. So if you go back to time before we were preoccupied with technology and we were so overwhelmed with messages like we are today, that was the way that we really learned, our ancestors actually really learned how to connect with spirit. Native Americans, for instance, talk to rocks. They hear messages in the wind. They hear all of these messages on a regular basis. I did an entire presentation about how rocks have sentience, they have consciousness. Literally everything does.
Mhm.
And so the point is, we are too preoccupied with what I call noise to pay attention to the consciousness of plants, of animals, of you've heard of earthing, walking
Mhm.
barefoot in grass changes your frequency. I mean, it's phenomenal the messages that we get from our environment that we are just really too distracted to pay attention to. So in this modern day, instead of trying to hear it, we just go run all of that stuff, all of that noise out of our heads so that we are so depleted mentally and physically. And then we're in a space to let everything else in. And that's when the magic happens.
Mm. That's really interesting. So does this just happen with ultra running, or does it also happen with other endurance sports?
I have found that cyclists have the same experience, hikers have the same experience. Those are the only endurance sports that I studied outside of this. Actually, an interview coming up with someone who is looking into the connection with type of the karate. Oh, I can't, it's 100 man something. You test for a black belt 100 times in one day.
Mhm.
And the sparring actually goes for 1.5 to 2 minutes. Anyway, the point is, I do believe that there are a lot of sports that will have this type of experience. Athletes will have this experience in different sports. In all honesty, I've only studied running the most, and then hiking. Obviously, a lot of the monks, i.e., they're hiking, they're not actually running, and the a little bit of the cycling.
Okay. So what point do these mystical experiences occur? I think you mentioned between mile 30 and 40, it tends to start with running. So how long do people have to endure before they start having these experiences?
Every single person is different. For me, this is interesting too. It was around mile 30, or
Hmm.
actually maybe a little bit before that. But I will tell you this, Holly, there's a whole section in my book, as you know, about meditating. And
Hmm.
I am an avid meditator. When I am actively meditating every day, which is my commitment to myself for the new year, because I have been letting that slide. When I'm actively meditating every day, it is much easier to get into that state, and I get into it much more quickly. But I also know that, like I said, everyone is different. But I have never talked to an ultra runner who has not experienced that in some way.
Okay, so you mentioned that meditation helps us to get into this state. That makes absolute sense. How long do you meditate?
Absolutely. So let me say, first of all, that active meditation is meditation. I
Mhm.
think the misconception that most people have is that you have to sit and be absolutely quiet and clear your mind and whatever.
Mm.
Yes, that absolutely is meditation.
Mhm.
But there are so many different forms of meditation. If you can get rid of the junk and ultra focus on what you're doing, or just get into the zone, that's
Mm.
really what
Yeah.
it is. So people meditate when they're gardening. They
Yeah.
meditate when they are doing something they love, painting or singing or playing an instrument. It's not just a physical activity. However, with physical activity, you have a hard time clearing your mind.
Mm.
That'll do it. There's nothing that'll do it quite like physical activity if you are having difficulty. For me, I have found many years ago when I lived in Colorado, I would go out for really long hikes and get all that out. And I didn't even know what I was doing. And I was having visions. I was experiencing something I couldn't explain. And it wasn't until I started doing this research that I remembered, I've been doing this for a while and didn't even realize it with the acute perception that I do now.
Mm, interesting. And I think that's really interesting what you say about you'd mentioned martial arts earlier because I am an ultra runner. I also do kickboxing. And I've noticed that with kickboxing and sparring, it is like meditation because you can't think about anything else. You can't let your mind wander. You are absolutely focused in the present moment. You're kind of subconsciously analyzing, but not actively. It's just you're just purely focused.
Absolutely. I can't remember. I'm trying to remember who I talked to who was doing the same thing, or maybe I read it. Basically, it came down to this: you can't think before you act.
Mm,
And so in martial arts, if you are not, and I don't do martial arts, but from what this person was telling me, you don't have time to think about
no,
it.
no, you're just
You
responding or acting.
Exactly. So if you're in that zone and you're responding like intuitively, it is intuitively. If you're
Yeah,
responding
yeah,
intuitively, you're going to be very, very successful in that regard. If you are having to think about it, it's too late.
yep,
That's
yep.
the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I also thought really interesting what you said in your book about how ultra runners experience hypoxia, which is when cells do not receive adequate oxygen. And that researchers have found that hypoxia can introduce an elevated expression of DMT. That's really, really interesting. And I'm not surprised that that coincides with the mystical experiences that we get from ultra running and other endurance sports. Can you speak more to that?
I can. So I am very, very fortunate to work at LSU with some of the most brilliant minds in the world. I did work and did interview some people who are the premier researchers in that area of DMT. I was very, very fortunate to do so. And so one of them, actually, I did interview in my book. In the chapter, I did talk about the mind and the brain. I had to go back to them and say, I know you're super busy. Can you please read this and make sure I got it right? Because that's way beyond my comprehension. But what I can tell you is what they were studying a couple years ago. There was a belief, and I'm not sure where this is right now in research, that we are actually also producing DMT in our lungs. Now,
Mm.
if this is true, there are currently receptors. I'm not even saying this correctly, not just receptors, but conductive, I don't remember. Nonetheless, it is possible that is happening. However, it's not real easy to prove. So we know that DMT is produced in the pineal gland in our brains. And we also know that when we're meditating, it's much easier to access that. Dr. Joe Dispenza, if you are interested in looking into him, if you haven't already,
Hmm.
he is really phenomenal about talking about DMT and accessing it. You can literally breathe and picture just a technique, for instance. If you are sitting straight up and you take a deep breath in and you feel it starting at the base of your spine and you push it like you're actually tensing up all of your muscles all the way up your spine, that process will literally create the release of DMT in your pineal gland. So
Interesting.
look up Joe. He's phenomenal. I will tell you that through ultra running, there's also the idea of fight or flight.
Yeah.
So that in and of itself releases DMT. So we've got a lot of DMT production going on in the process of physical endurance.
Mm.
So that endurance is automatically the fight or flight, the endurance levels, all of that. So there are a lot of contributors to that. I don't know them all, but I can tell you for sure that we know at least the idea of the fight or flight, and you were just mentioning they're very integral parts of that experience.
So, for someone who might not know what DMT is or what effect that has on us, can you speak a little bit to that?
Please don't ask me to pronounce it because I cannot. Focusing on how many years I have been studying this, and I just still cannot. I don't know what it is, but regardless, DMT is a chemical that is endogenous. All of us can produce it. Plants produce it. Animals produce it. Some of your listeners may know this as ayahuasca.
Hmm.
Ayahuasca is actually using plant DMT to have experiences. And there are all kinds of shaman in the Amazon rainforest, and I'm finding more and more that are doing it in other places as well. There's research all over the world, except in the United States, because we have some issues with plant medicine. But nonetheless, the research is finding that when we are accessing DMT outside of our systems, we are actually kind of on an overload. In
Mm.
other words, every single drug that you could take, our bodies are already producing it. So, literally, if we are taking this drug externally or this plant medicine, if you will, we're already producing that.
Hmm.
So, we are then creating an extreme reaction to DMT if we are ingesting it externally. I know in the rainforest, I believe they use a tea, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So all of that just suggests that if we can access it more within ourselves, we don't really need to look externally for it. And there are some wonderful ways to do that. The breathing techniques, which you would have to listen to Dr. Joe because he knows his stuff much better than I do, obviously. Ultra running, as I found through my research.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard of Joe Dispenza over the years and I've read some of his stuff, but I did not realize he had done so much research in respect to DMT. So I'm going to have to check him out again.
He is phenomenal. Actually, I follow him. And so every new thing he has to say, I'm all over it. He's the one, I would say, one of the premier experts when it comes to DMT in our brains and how to access it. And he's just a phenomenal researcher. I think we're very lucky to have that kind of a mind who can really help it more accessible to people without fear that it's a drug because medicine is a drug. And so we just
Mm.
overreact to that, right? Not
Yeah.
us, you and I, but our culture, unfortunately. So yeah, check him out.
Mm.
Definitely.
Will do. So, what are your personal experiences with ultra-running mysticism and how have they changed since you wrote this book?
I would like to say that they have changed, but I don't think they have because every experience is very different. It depends. For instance, I wanted to put this in my book, but there was so much I wanted to put in my book. It just would have been too much. I thought at the time anyway. When you are slightly sleep deprived, there are other things that are going on in your
Mm.
brain also. If you have a heightened sense because one of your other senses is somewhat depleted, for instance, running at night, I
Mm.
love running at night.
Me too.
So if you can put me in a woods I don't even care if it's
Yes.
the middle of the night, I'm good to go. I'll be slower, which I
Yeah.
don't care, but I will have those experiences much more quickly than if I'm running in the daylight. If there are other people around, I'm less likely to have that experience because now I'm distracted with other people. Even if we're all in the zone together, I'm still distracted by their presence. So these days, when I travel, even to go hiking, I'm planning a trip to the Grand Canyon. I did part of the Colorado Trail in October. I want to be alone.
Yes.
I want to be completely alone. I want to go out there and have whatever experience I'm going to have. Nothing is right or wrong or good or bad, that experience. And if I'm lucky, it's going to lead me to this feeling, this mysticism, or as I originally started going toward it, is the idea of experiencing the sublime or God.
Mm, mm. That's so interesting what you say about darkness and running at night. I love running at night. And one of the things that I love most is to leave my house when it's kind of, there's still light out, it's starting to get dark, and get to this point where I go into the woods just as it's getting dark and I have to turn on my lamp. And it's like, I don't know, it's so beautiful. It's like I can hear the owls hooting in the trees and the leaves. And it's like the sound is amplified. And I always go without music because I want to hear the nature. It's just so beautiful. Even when I'm not running long distance, it could just be a short walk, but there's a run, but there's something about running in the woods in the dark. It's like I can feel the smile on my face when I'm doing it because it's so beautiful.
I love that. And yes, you're absolutely right. And I think part of that is also distraction. Part of it is distraction of what you see and what you hear. I personally am best. I get up sometimes at midnight. I'll go to bed early
Wow.
and I'll get up at midnight and I'll just get out there. And I love doing that. My friends make fun of me when it's 7 o'clock. When isn't that way past your bedtime? Yes, as a matter of fact, it is. And here's why, because I like to get up early before people are out, before there is, and we can get into this whole discussion of energy. The
Yeah.
energy is calm.
Yes.
There's no chaos. You don't have to deal with that energy of other people, of electronics, of whatever. All of that noise is subdued substantially. So you're more likely to be able to have that kind of an experience. It's phenomenal. I don't have to tell you, you know.
Mm. So how early do you get up to go on runs?
It depends on how many miles I'm going to do that
Mm.
day. For instance, tomorrow I'm going to do I probably 20.
Mhm.
So my goal is to be done before there's traffic, before people are doing what people do,
Mm.
because those are the most enjoyable hours for me.
Mhm.
So it just depends on how I'm feeling when I wake up, how long it's going to take me to run 20 miles. Sometimes I'm just not into it, and that's
Yeah.
okay. Sometimes I'm raring to go. So I'll kind of judge at the time, but I'll probably get up at about 1.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, I have to have my morning cuddle time with my dogs. It's kind of a thing because that's just important to me. I'll take them out and then I'll just hit it.
Wow.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't live close to any trails. So I would have to travel quite a ways to be able to do that in the early morning hours. So running in my neighborhood is just as good. We're surrounded by swamps and whatever. So I do get
Yes.
past these little areas where it's just nature, even if they're small, it's something. I absolutely love it. Yeah.
So I know we've touched on this a few times, but how can people evoke these experiences of ultra running mysticism or be more open to experiencing them?
I think that I know, first of all, and you may have been the same way, Holly, when you first heard of ultra running, I went, whoa, okay, I can run a marathon, but I'm not sure about these crazy people. And then I got a little arrogant, right? Then I got a little, oh, it's only a few more miles more than a marathon. I can do
Yeah.
that. And I think we all go through that. So I think that I would encourage people that, first of all, trail running is a lot different and you're
Yeah.
more likely to have those experiences on the trail, even if you are just hiking. I have a whole chapter about environmental psychology and the benefits of being around nature. They're good for both our mental health and our physical health when we are in the middle of all of what is happening and the magic of nature. So that is a much better situation, at least in my perspective, to do that. But nonetheless, I think that if you can really clear your mind, if you can't run hard,
Yeah.
that'll do it. But if you can clear your mind enough, running very slowly or hiking will be perfect for you.
Mm.
And I don't think it has to be an ultra running experience. But
Mhm.
nonetheless, if you choose to, it definitely will become more intense when you overcome suffering.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting what you say also about being alone and being able to do it when you're alone, because I've done a lot of kind of easier, I'm saying with air quotes, hiking experiences where I've been backpacking and I prefer to do it alone. And it's like when I go through this period where I'm not necessarily experiencing pain, I'm not necessarily suffering, but it's like I've been alone on the trail, walking for so many hours, haven't seen people for several miles. And I get into this kind of flow state with my head. And it's very similar.
It probably is very similar, if not the same. I know that what happens when, like I said, when we're meditating, I do
Yeah.
believe we access that a lot
Yeah.
faster. There are times when a few of people I interviewed, include, and I've experienced it myself, I don't even feel myself moving anymore. I am so in the zone. I'm so in that place where I stop and I go, wow, I can't even feel my legs at the moment.
Mm.
And you just don't even think about it because you're so engrossed in that feeling that you don't even feel the actual movement. And that is remarkable. That doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And whenever something new happens, like, hey, what's that? Rather than just enjoying it and going with it, right? So my analytical mind will have a tendency to try to evaluate what could be going on. But fortunately, I should say, I get to experience that before I start to get analytical about it. And it's a tremendous experience.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about your book and this strange state of mind that we experience. The thing I loved about your book the most is that it's like I've experienced this so many times, but I didn't have the words for it, and you gave me the words to kind of understand it. So thank you for writing this book to put words to the experience that I didn't know how to describe.
Well, thank you, Holly, because I think a lot of people are in that situation too, right? I think that what happens is when we have experiences, we don't know exactly what they are.
Mm.
We want to be able to define them. That's why philosophy is so wonderful, right? Because once you have at least somewhere to start, then you can take it from there. And that's
Yeah.
what I did with this book. This was originally my thesis. It took a life of its own, and it's no longer thesis material because I
Wow.
just got too excited and I had to start. So nonetheless, it was basically what I wanted to know. And I
Mhm.
wanted other ultra runners to at least have an idea of what it was also if they were so curious.
Mm. And I think they are. I mean, we've all heard about the runner's high, but I think this goes much beyond that.
I'm sorry, runner's high is primarily the release of what we would consider endorphins, which is
Yeah.
essentially morphine, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the morphine experience, like I said, all drugs, we are already creating them. Runner's high is morphine, whereas ultra running is DMT.
Yeah.
It's not that we don't experience the whole runner's high with the endorphins. I mean, certainly we can and we do, but this is a very different thing that short, hard runs are not going to give you.
I like what you said there about how runner's high is endorphins and ultra running is DMT. I think it's a clear chemical difference.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is.
Mm. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. Where can people find you online and learn more about what you do and find your book?
My book is on Amazon. It's self-published, and I'm not as big into social media as a lot of people are. I value my time to meditate
Yeah.
much more than need this. So I am on Facebook, and I do have some other friends who have become friends who read the
Mhm.
book and reached out to me. And I'm so thankful that they could get something of use from this book and identify the things that they had been going through. And that has been a real, real gift to me that it has helped others to be able to define their experiences. And I feel very satisfied when I know that it has helped other people do the same thing that it helps me to do. And so, yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Holly, for having me on your podcast. I have really enjoyed talking to you. You are a phenomenal person, and I love what you do. Keep being awesome.
Oh, thanks, Gwen. It was great talking to you.
Thank you.
So please drop me a line and let me know what you thought of this week's episode. You can email me at holly@hollywharton.com or find me online and get in touch there. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to check out one of these related ones. 469, I talk about how to crew for an ultramarathon. 468, I talk with Eric Dieter about how to use the ultramarathon mindset to get your epic life. 450, I talk about adventures in endurance. 416, I talk about lessons learned from my first ultra. And episode 400 is called Life is an Ultra. So again, these concepts don't just apply to ultra running. They can also be ultra running, walking, hiking, cycling, or other sports. So thank you so much for listening. And remember to visit hollywharton.com/493 for the show notes on this episode. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening to Into the Woods with Holly Wharton. You can find more information about today's episode, including links for topics that were discussed, at hollywharton.com. That's HOLLYWORTON.com. If you'd like to connect with other listeners and get support on your journey, I would love for you to join my private community on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Holly Wharton. That's patreon.com/Holly Wharton. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.